Hello, everyone. So, our next talk is Press B to Belong by Dr. Matthew Harrison and Jess Rowlings. This talk will dig into the role of esports in fostering inclusive education. It examines how schools can create environments where every student feels a sense of belonging, focusing on strategies and supports used by teachers in 6 esports programs. So, without further ado,
Thank you.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for coming along. I know it's getting later in this last day of the conference, so everyone gets a bit tired. We really appreciate you coming along to our session. I'm Jess. I'm here with my colleague Matt today, and we'll introduce our background shortly. But today we want to share our work on creating inclusive esports programs in schools. So something we do in Australia is we just acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and waters that we're working on. We're from Melbourne, Australia, which is the Aboriginal people, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. But today, we just want to acknowledge, the people who've worked this land before us. So introducing ourselves, I'm a speech pathologist by trade, but I now work as a researcher at the University of Melbourne in the Faculty of Education, and I'm also doing my PhD in the experiences of neurodivergent adult women in gaming communities. I'm also CEO and co-founder of Next Level Collaboration, which is a social enterprise that runs video game-based social capacity building programs that support neurodivergent children. I'm actually neurodivergent myself. So I was diagnosed with autism when I was 19 and ADHD when I was 22. But I always knew that I was different growing up. There was no doubt about that. But I never had a concrete answer as to why. I just knew I was different. I didn't fit the stereotypes for autism or ADHD back then in the early 2000s. So I got diagnosed when I was an adult. And for me, that was such a game changer. I didn't feel like a broken neurotypical, and I could actually figure out how my brain worked and the ways I needed to live my life to work for me. I'll hand over to Matt now to talk about your background.
Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm Matt. I'm a researcher and teacher by background. I've been lucky enough to teach in Australia, South Korea, and the UK. I currently train teachers to work with kids who are neurodivergent. Like Jess, I'm neurodivergent myself. I have ADHD. And I have a real passion around the intersection of technologies, neurodiversity, and inclusive education. So I sort of work in the middle of that wonderful space.
Thanks, Matt. There we go. We also worked on this project with Dan Martinez, who is on the right. Dan's a legend. He's a teacher in Australia. And he leads the Fuse Cup, which is I think they now work all the way across the Asia Pacific, but a school esports league. He's in Queensland, Australia, so much sunnier than Melbourne. Unfortunately, he's not here today, but we do just want to recognise the work his help put into this too. So our project started with a very, very broad question of how do we create the conditions for inclusion within esports programs? And we did 3 different things to help answer this question. Firstly, we reviewed the existing literature and the research around school-based esports programs, and also the conditions in these programs that help create inclusion for students, particularly those from marginalised backgrounds. We also interviewed some really awesome esports leaders from 6 different schools, and each of these schools had a high proportion of students from a historically marginalised community. We really wanted to learn about their experiences and the specific things that they've done to structure their esports programs to really support these students. So we had people who were working with a lot of female students, students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, culturally and linguistically diverse students, as well as students with physical disabilities. We took all this information and put it together to develop what we call the Everyone Can Play Inclusive Esports Framework. So we looked at the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities because we really wanted to better understand those different levels of inclusion and what needs to happen for a program to be considered truly inclusive. This slide has a visual representation of the different levels of inclusion. Matt and I are gamers. We like Pikmin. You might have seen this diagram before, but we thought Pikmin might be a good way to represent it. But something we really wanted to focus on was how to remove that kind of inner fence that separates inclusion from integration from full inclusion. We found that the biggest differences for what could be considered a truly inclusive program were that they remove barriers and support individual differences so that everyone has an equal opportunity to participate. And they also promoted a sense of belonging, which was really, really important for that subjective experience of feeling like they're included. But a sense of belonging wasn't the only thing that was really important for inclusion. We looked at the participation model, which is by, I'm going to say Edstrom. It's a Swedish last name. It could be very wrong. But this is designed to be a tool for identifying and supporting student participation at that broader group level. And the participation model has these 6 keys that focus on how and where social and academic inclusion occurs. We adapted these to guide teachers to help them design and implement esports programs that are inclusive for everyone. So the keys, we've got belonging, formal and informal, interaction, accessibility, so physical, communicative, and meaning context accessibility, autonomy, involvement, and acceptance. Notice each of these keys also translates to an area of our Everyone Can Play framework. Matt, I'll hand over to you to talk through the framework.
Thank you, Jess. Yeah, so we're really excited. We've actually mapped these 6 keys against these 4 levels of inclusion. Participation being the first one. So to be able to be included in an esports program, you physically have to be in the space, or you have to be allowed to join the esports program. Then the idea of individualized support. So for example, if you have some players who have physical access needs, that may be providing them with individualized controllers that allow them to be able to access the game. Think of like Microsoft's Adaptive Controller as an example of this with its Switch-based controls. Universal support is the next level. And that is really best understood by thinking about, rather than saying, hey, you have physical access needs, here's a special controller for you. It's thinking about, here's a range of controllers. People can choose the controller they want to use. Jess and I, we try to actively model this by sometimes using different controllers and not making a big deal out of it. The research is really strong around this. It's saying about this choice and voice, and normalizing the use of different controllers is really important. The 4th level is this idea of community. And this is where people actually feel like they have ownership over this esports space. There is nothing wrong with running an esports program at level 1. There's not. Participation, because it's the starting point. Getting the kids from all these different backgrounds, all these different marginalized communities together and actually playing is a big win. There's a lot of exclusion happening in Australian schools. I'm sure it's happening around the world too. But working our way through this framework, you'll be able to work towards that level of community. It's really important. Just to help illustrate this, I'll have the example of belonging. And as Jess mentioned, we have these 2 levels. There's formal belonging, that you're actually allowed to join the club. And there's an informal belonging where you have a sense of feeling welcome, like you belong there. As you can see, formal belonging has different indicators at each of the 4 levels. Informal belonging has indicators only at level 3 and level 4. That's because you first need that formal belonging before you can get to that informal belonging, that feeling welcome and feeling like you belong there. So we've gone through our framework and mapped each of those 6 keys against these different levels. So people using this framework can actually assess where they're at with their own esports program and look and see, okay, where to next. We encourage you to actually do this with your players. Really interesting to see what their perceptions are of their communities and see where their enablers and their barriers are throughout your community. It's really interesting. Just to give you some examples of some of the enablers and barriers that we've seen, we're just focusing here on neurodivergent players. Examples of enablers include video games generally offering a range of communication options. Example, voice chat, text chat, in-game emotes, love a good emote, and normalizing that. That's really important. And then having video games having those clear mechanics and boundaries of play. They explicitly define what players can and cannot do in that game. Makes it really, games are really good at that. We know that. And making the rules really clear. We do know that sometimes labels associated with neurodivergent identities can be used as part of trash talk. We hear this a lot. People saying, oh, you're autistic, and using that in a derogatory sense. We work very hard to counter that narrative around that trash talk, but our kids, our young adults are hearing this a lot. So that is a really clear barrier there. And we also, the idea of some of our players are, unfortunately, they're not as aware of some of those inappropriate comments being inappropriate and people, I guess, isolating them without them being aware of that. So that's a real barrier for a lot of the players that we work with. Okay, we only have 10 minutes today, so if you want to know more about this, we do have a book coming out called Press B to Belong. It's available on the 27th of July. I believe that's Australian time, so that would be 28th of July for you. So, no, back a day, 26th. You get it a day early. That's good. There's also a really great resource on the Spotlight on Girls with Autism, which is by a charity in Australia called Yellow Ladybugs. Phenomenal charity for autistic and non-binary girls and women around really around things that educators and esports facilitators can do to make life easier for neurodivergent girls and women and people who are non-binary. And finally, I've got a book as well called Using Video Games to Level Up Collaboration, if you're interested in co-op gaming and using that within an esports space. I'll pause for photo. That's good. And, oh, sorry, James. Thanks, Dred. And I believe we have 1 minute for questions and answers. So, does anyone have a question? I could, while we're doing questions and answers, I can put the email addresses up on the screen.
Quick, outside of Australia, have you had anybody this? What?
This is published for the first time on the 26th of July in America. The framework. Yeah, so this is in the new book, the latest research. In terms of, do you mean the our co-op gaming groups?
No, yeah.
The framework, yeah, no, you're seeing it for the first time.
Dan, his esports competition league started out in Australia, but it has now moved into Asia Pacific. So we've built on his knowledge as well. So it's going to be really exciting. And as his program keeps expanding further and further, we'll have more international recognition as well.
Congratulations, you're on the cutting edge. Are there any other questions? Comments? Concerns? Melissa Valance, who is an absolutely phenomenal artist and someone who works with us. Very, very cool. And I think has captured us very well. Okay. We might hand over to the next person because I know we've got a tight schedule today. So thank you very much.